Okay. Hi, my name is Gail Gladstone. I'm the Cultural Resource Program Manager at Acadia National Park. Just a little background, this project started in 2018 when a gentleman came up to the park headquarters with his wife, and he said he was in the Job Corps at Acadia in the 1960s. And I knew vaguely what he was talking about, but not really. I gave them a little tour of the campus, and he was excited to see how much things had changed since he had been there. And I got a sense that he had good memories of his time in the Job Corps. And then he left, and I never got his name or his contact information. And now I have so many questions for him. And that's a lesson for me for sure. But now we have jumping ahead. I'm excited to introduce the two historians we were so fortunate to connect with for this historic resource study. Dr. Angela Cerna is National Park Service historian who had been working on a Job Corps history at Catoctin Mountain Park in Maryland. Dr. Cerna now leads the park history program for the Intermountain region based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Previously, she has worked for parks in the National Capital Region and was a historian for the Southeast Regional Office. Her research interests have focused on the history of social programs in the National Park Service. She earned her PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University and a master's in history from West Virginia University. And Dr. Laura Miller is a public historian and historical consultant based in Western Massachusetts. She specializes in research, writing, and oral history projects for history organizations and other nonprofits. She has worked on several consulting projects for the National Park Service, including an administrative history of Adams National Historical Park in Quincy, Massachusetts. And she is currently writing an administrative history of Eisenhower National Historic Site in Gettysburg. She earned her PhD in history and has a master's in public history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. This historic resource study was completed through an agreement between the National Park Service and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I think we're going to start off with Angie. Take it away.
We're actually going to start with me.
I was about to say, just kidding. We're going to start with Laura.
Okay, go.
Thank you, Gail. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Miller. Thank you all for joining us today. Angie and I are so excited to be here with you and share the history of the Acadia Job Corps Conservation Center. The Job Corps was a program that was part of President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. It sought to improve the job prospects of poor young men and women through education and work training. And Acadia was one of 9 Job Corps conservation centers run by the National Park Service. It was opened between 1966 and 1969, and during that time, approximately 900 young men received training at the center. Before we dive into the details, we thought we would start with a little bit of background on the project. Angie reached out to me back in the summer of 2019 to see if I might be interested in being the principal investigator for this historic resource study. And I was very interested. I'm a historian who studies race and ethnicity in the post-war period, as well as environmental history and the history of the National Park Service. And all of those things intersect in this project. And I was excited by the prospect of working with Angie, who I knew through shared public history circles and who came to the project having already researched and written extensively about the history of Job Corps. So over the next 2 years, we co-authored this study. Most of it was written at the height of the pandemic with the incredible assistance of Gail and also Marie Yarborough at Acadia. We couldn't have done this without them. Angie and I divided the research and writing. Angie's chapters focused on the National and National Park Service context for the study, as well as a chapter examining the history of the Catoctin Job Corps Conservation Center. And my chapters looked at civil rights and the war on poverty in Maine, corpsman life at the center, and the center's closing in 1969. We drew on a variety of sources for this study, oral history interviews, research in Black newspapers and magazines, local newspapers like the Bar Harbor Times and the Ellsworth American, and of course, research in Acadia's own collections, as well as the collections of Catoctin Mountain Park and the National Archives at College Park. Research for this project was definitely a challenge. not only because most of it was written at the height of the pandemic, but also because the archival record was rather limited and we had a very hard time for finding former corpsmen to interview for the study. So before I turn things over to Angie, I thought I'd just quickly share why we think this study is so important. Angie, you can go, yeah. So important both for Acadia National Park and the National Park Service and the history of conservation more broadly. This research reveals an important and largely untold history of young people of color and impoverished whites at Acadia National Park. At a time when the Park Service is working to promote equity and access to the nation's public lands, it offers an important corrective to whitewashed narratives of conservation in the United States. We also see this as a starting point for future historical research and interpretation of youth conservation programs at other national parks. We hope other National Park Service sites that had Job Corps centers will kind of investigate this history in their own parks. And finally, we see the study as having important contemporary relevance for public debates about youth conservation programs. And Angie's going to talk a little bit more about that later in our talk. So now I will turn it over to Angie, who's going to talk a little bit about the national context and the National Park Service perspective.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thanks, Gail, for organizing this brown bag lunch webinar today. And thanks to all of you for spending your lunch hour with us. So I started my research on the Job Corps 10 years ago when I was a seasonal historian at Catoctin Mountain Park. And I have about 10 minutes to distill that research into kind of a national service-wide context for the Job Corps, which I'm happy to do. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one of my favorite podcasts, they have a format where it's 5 things that you need to know about whatever topics. I'm going to do 5 things for you to know about the Job Corps from a Park Service point of view. So the first thing to know about the Job Corps is that it began as a war on poverty program in 1964 under President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. So Johnson had a vision for America called the Great Society, which I'm sure you've heard about. And the Great Society really rested on 2 things. One was racial equality, which you saw with all the civil rights legislation passed during his tenure. And then also he declared a war on poverty. So extending economic opportunities to all Americans who had been left behind during this time of a lot of post-war affluence. And so Congress in August of 1964 passed a piece of legislation called the Economic Opportunity Act, which really gave teeth to the war on poverty. And it created a whole host of programs, some of which are still around today. So for example, Head Start was created through this piece of legislation, and so was college work study programs. It also created youth job training programs such as the Neighborhood Youth Corps and the Job Corps. The legislation also created a federal agency to organize all these new programs called the Office of Economic Opportunity. And that was headed by Sergeant Shriver, who was the architect of the Peace Corps and also brother-in-law to President John F. Kennedy. So the second thing you should know was that the Job Corps was initially modeled directly after the 1930s Civilian Conservation Corps program. So the 2 programs are very similar in a lot of different aspects. You know, they targeted the same kind of age group of young people between 16 and 21 years old. The Job Corps conservation centers were based on public lands, so young men could live and work and learn in national parks, national forests. So there are a lot of similarities between the 2 programs. Now, the Job Corps actually experimented a little and created new types of centers. Urban men's centers and then urban women's centers. But the centers that the National Park Service operated, they were all conservation centers. So here they had 9 Job Corps centers in 8 national parks between 1965 and 1969. Here's a map. You'll see that they're all located west of the Mississippi River. Several of them are in the Appalachian region, which was kind of a target area for the war on poverty. And here is just a table, and I don't expect you to read all of this, but just to give you a sense of the centers, where they were located, what parks they were associated with, the towns they were closest to, and also how many corpsmen they could accommodate. So most of these centers, all but 3 could accommodate around 100 men. 3 could accommodate about 200. So a lot of similarities with the CCC, but there was one key difference between the CCC and the Job Corps, and that was race. So the CCC was segregated. Only about 10% of the participants in the CCC were African American, whereas the Job Corps, since it was created shortly after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, it was integrated right from the beginning. And so these centers had upwards of 50–60% persons of color in these centers. So I think that, and what we have found through our research at Acadia and in some of the other centers that I've looked at, these are really interesting windows into the civil rights period in our national parks, because you have these young men who you came from all different kinds of backgrounds living together during this really tumultuous time in American history. They're also located in rural areas near, predominantly white communities. So there's some tensions there. And then also, you have staff that are hired to run these centers that are supposed to reflect the diversity of the corpsmen who are there. So there's this whole kind of layer of racial history that I think is really interesting. It can provide a window into the civil rights period in our national parks. And I think it also complicates, it provides us a different view of the civil rights period that, normally focuses on things like sit-ins and boycotts and marches that were really focused in southern cities. So this is kind of a different view of that period. So the other thing, so number 4 thing for you to know is that the National Park Service involvement in the Job Corps was very short-lived, but it was a very impactful time. So the National Park Service was very interested in becoming involved in the program because they had so much success from the CCC during the 1930s. They were very interested in having a whole labor pool of young men to work and help with, all the maintenance needs of our national parks. So they were involved right from the beginning. They had the very first center in the entire country at Catoctin Mountain Park. And they also learned a lot of the first lessons of this program at these initial centers that were open during this time. So, they had really high expectations that they could replicate the success of the CCC, but, it was a different time. It was a different generation, is a different, just a whole different set of circumstances. And so it was a, kind of a rocky start. They had high dropouts, a number of men that just didn't stick around in the first few weeks. They had staffing issues, just all sorts of different things that they had to figure out. And they did, like, as things went on, it got better. And they were able to apply these lessons to other centers that opened. But in 1969, President Nixon won the presidency, and he, was interested in scaling back Johnson's, Great Society domestic programs. And so the Job Corps was a program that was scaled back. It's still around. Nixon did not get rid of it completely, but there were some major changes that happened. One is that he scaled back the conservation centers. So he closed 59 centers in 1969, including all but 3 of the National Park Service Job Corps centers. And he also changed the administration from the Office of Economic Opportunity. He transferred it to the Department of Labor as being primarily responsible for the Job Corps. So some pretty big changes that occurred during that time. And the National Park Service kind of got out of the Job Corps program for the most part, even though they still had 3 centers that operated. So the Forest Service actually operates those centers now, so not the Park Service. But some of the people who were involved with the Job Corps during that time went on to be involved in other NPS youth programs that replaced the Job Corps. So I argue that, a lot of the lessons learned from the Job Corps were taken over to subsequent NPS youth programs. And my final point is that Job Corps centers, even though they were open for a very short period of time, did have a significant impact on national park landscapes. So the centers themselves were kind of like a college campus. They had dormitories and administrative offices and workshops and different types of things. So those had a pretty big impact on the landscape. And when these centers closed, parks just took them over for other uses. So here we have the site plan for McFarland Hill at Acadia. And now it is the administrative headquarters for the park. And when these centers first opened, they weren't complete. So corpsmen, when they arrived, they had to finish the centers themselves. And so at Acadia, one of the big things that the corpsmen built was this gymnasium. So if you think about Acadia in the harsh winters and you think about these young men, they needed a place to go hang out and recreate. So this gymnasium was a really important place for them to go, and they built it themselves. They also did some pretty important projects in national parks. So here at Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, corpsmen restored some of the buildings at Hensley Settlement, which was a pretty big job. At Catoctin Mountain Park, they turned a former religious summer camp into what is now park headquarters. And then, of course, they also did a lot of, small scale things like signs and trail maintenance and, not very monumental things, but really important for you running a national park. And then finally, the budget for these work programs for these Job Corps centers did allow them to spend some of their time in the local communities to do projects. So this helped build community relations between these centers and these communities. So here we have corpsmen in Middlesboro, Kentucky from the Cumberland Gap Job Corps working on a playground. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Laura, and she's going to talk to you more about life at the Acadia Job Corps Center.
Thank you, Angie. As you guys can see, we have a lot of information that we're trying to condense into this very small amount of time. So I wanted to start by sharing some statistics about the Job Corps' enrollees. So demographics, the enrollees were approximately 50% African-American, 20% Latino, and 30% white. Acadia actually had a larger percentage of African-American enrollees at 56%. Many had dropped out of high school and were unemployed. 40% came from families receiving public assistance, and conservation centers like Acadia served corpsmen who had greater educational needs. In 1967, more than half of Acadia's corpsmen had completed 8 or less grades of school, and the median education levels were 3rd grade reading and 4th grade math. Geographically, the largest percentage came from large cities, and then smaller amounts from mid-sized towns and rural areas. And at Acadia specifically, we know that corpsmen came from all over the United States and its territories. Again, in 1967, there were 48 corpsmen from New York, 14 from Maine, 12 from New Jersey. There was this very large contingent from the US Virgin Islands, 17 corpsmen. And one document that we looked at described the center as having, quote, a fair percentage of rural New England corpsmen, but it didn't give any specific numbers, but these were presumably poor white enrollees from throughout the region. So we have all these statistics about the enrollees, but they paint a very incomplete picture of the corpsmen's lives. And this is where oral histories and published interviews and archival documents help balance out the Office of Economic Opportunity statistics. So I did my best to incorporate some of their words into this presentation in an effort to provide kind of a counterbalance to these rather impersonal statistics. So arriving at the Job Corps Conservation Center could be a very jarring experience for the corpsmen. Most arrived in Maine by plane or by bus and endured a long journey to the center. Former corpsman named Phil Ranger, who was interviewed by Gail and Marie before this project got started, he was 16 years old when he joined the Job Corps, and he came from Southern California. And he recalled arriving in Bar Harbor late at night and it was cold. And he recalled, when I got up here, it's like, what did I do wrong? You know, it's like at midnight, I'm looking around and I see nothing but snow and cold. It was like being off the end of the earth. And we know that the disorientation was especially strong for African-American and Latino young men who were sent to these centers in overwhelmingly white communities like Bar Harbor, where they were not universally welcomed by local community members. An African-American corpsman named Charles Bradley came to Acadia from New York City. And he recalled, I was living in a dominant Black neighborhood and I went to Job Corps and there were whites and other races there. And I was afraid because I had never seen that living in a Black neighborhood all my life. Once corpsmen settled in to life at the Acadia Center, their day-to-day experience included a combination of job training and educational classes. They were taught reading, writing, math, and study skills, and for some of the Spanish-speaking corpsmen, they received English language instruction if needed. Corpsmen were introduced to a variety of vocational training skills, including conservation, masonry, auto repair, heavy equipment operation, welding, and carpentry. And they sometimes took field trips to local businesses and met with local industry leaders. Within Acadia National Park, next slide, yeah. Within Acadia National Park, they completed projects including trail maintenance, clearing brush, clearing snow from the roads and walkways, digging ditches, and a variety of projects that required using heavy equipment like excavation and backfilling. They also created concrete wheel stops for the park's parking lots. My cat is making an appearance, as I fear. She's going to sit on my lap because it's the only way to keep her quiet. They welded campsite fireplaces, they built picnic tables, and helped construct the center's gym, as Angie mentioned. Within the community, corpsmen did a variety of work projects. In 1967, they rebuilt a town pier and built boat storage in Blue Hill. They graded a sports field and they cleared a glide path at Bar Harbor's airport. They also constructed the Seal Cove Fishway and Dam. They tidied up overgrown cemeteries and they cleaned up the island's beaches. Again, I have a quote from Corpsman Phil Ranger, who described the work of clearing up overgrown cemeteries. He said they'd take like 50 guys in there with all the equipment and lunches and everything. And we'd spend a day right there just clearing out the brush, opening everything up. One particular place that we did was facing over a bluff out by the water. And I've never, ever forgotten that. I felt like we were achieving something, you know, to open that up so people could go in there and look at the graveyard. To me, that's achieving something. That's history. In their leisure time was really important for young men who were far from home and extremely isolated. And recreational activities could be a release, a time to relax, and also a time to travel beyond the center's confines. Corpsmen spent their free time exploring the island. They went into Bar Harbor and they also played sports, including boxing and baseball. They would travel to compete against other teams from other Job Corps centers. Or in the case of boxing, they also participated in matches at Bar Harbor's casino against other local boxers and also amateur regional matches. Other social activities included, I don't have a photo of this, I wish I did, but they would take visits to the Women's Job Corps Center in Poland Springs, Maine, which was a very popular activity for the corpsmen. And there was a very popular center music group called the Soul Brothers, who played local events and area dances. One of the members of the Soul Brothers was a musician named Charles Bradley, and he actually became famous later in life as a soul musician. He passed away in 2017 before we started working on this project, but luckily he sang the praises of the Acadia Job Corps Center in just about every interview that he gave. So we actually have a lot of information about his time at the Acadia Center. Another thing I wanted to just mention briefly is the politics of recreation. Corpsmen of color never felt fully welcomed into the local community, and this was probably most apparent in their recreational time when they were trying to relax and enjoy themselves outside of their work and educational duties. And these were the times that were often most fraught with tension and pushback from the local community. I included a couple quotes here to kind of give a sense of some of the challenges that they faced. The first is a quote from the center director, Hoyt Wilcox, who in the summer of 1966 reported that there appears to be a rising tide of anti-Negro feeling in Bar Harbor and Bangor. This is felt to be the result of the influx of summer residents and tourists. the corpsmen were under some misapprehension regarding their rights to retaliate. And this is a kind of a common theme that we would see in some of the park's archives, where the blame was often placed on tourists coming into the community, like those are the ones who are discriminating against the corpsmen. But in reality, there was a very tense relationship between the center and the local community, and it wasn't just coming from the tourists. Another quote that I thought was really interesting came from an article in the Ellsworth American newspaper in November 1966, and it was describing trying to establish sports fields for the corpsmen. And they were having a hard time deciding where to locate them because they wanted to basically keep them hidden from public view. And the reporter described both these efforts, and also he described it as them pretend they're supposed to pretend that they aren't there so as to not offend the sensibilities of tourists. And that applied both to the fields and to the corpsmen themselves. So the center closed in May 1969. The decision was upsetting both to corpsmen and staff, and it was made worse by the fact that the closing process was moving very quickly and left very little time for an organized conclusion to the program. So as a result, the exit statistics for the center's final year are particularly bleak. Although some corpsmen transferred to other Job Corps centers, about 5%, many more chose to resign altogether. 58% of the corpsmen resigned and 14% went AWOL. So I wanted to just end by talking a little bit about memory of the Job Corps Center at Acadia. This is the only remaining marker at the park that explicitly recognizes the Acadia Job Corps Conservation Center. And it's this tiny little plaque that's nailed to a picnic table constructed by the corpsmen. And it's located on the former site of the Job Corps Center, which is now Acadia's headquarters. And so it's not likely to be seen by any park visitors. You'd really have to hunt for it. And this kind of raised the question for us, why hasn't the Job Corps been remembered or interpreted at Acadia National Park or within the Park Service more broadly? And we decided that there are a few reasons. One is that much of the work that the corpsmen were doing was general maintenance work. They were clearing brush, they were shoveling snow, welding fireplaces. These aren't the kinds of efforts that generally garner lasting public recognition. Another reason is that there was a lot of negative media coverage of the Job Corps at the time, which has contributed to how the program has been remembered, or more accurately, forgotten. And some contemporary observers believed that the coverage really inaccurately shaped public opinion of the Job Corps. And finally, the Job Corps enrollees were largely young men of color, and people of color have long been purposely excluded from American conservation narratives. And you can see this in the way that the National Park Service and the public more broadly have embraced the history of the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, while basically ignoring the much more recent history of the Job Corps. And national parks like Acadia are still seen primarily as white spaces, and white people still dominate images of environmentalism in the United States. And the Job Corps, with its very diverse and integrated workforce, doesn't really fit this prevailing narrative. So we're really excited that this is starting to change, and that Acadia is looking for ways to explore this history further and incorporate it into interpretation. And we hope that other parks will follow suit. So now I'm going to turn it back to Angie to talk about our recommendations.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think you got us started with recommendations. I'm going to stick to my five things theme. So one of the recommendations that we have first and foremost is more oral histories. That was something that really frustrated us in this project, trying to find people. A lot of these young men just scattered after these centers closed, and they're very hard to track down. You know, the CCC had, they formed alumni organizations after World War II, and Job Corps, we don't really have that. So it's really hard to track people down, but we're hoping that raising the profile of this history as being something worth remembering and considering, that when people do show up, such as that gentleman at Acadia back a few years ago with Gail, park staff will know to get their contact information. If they are willing to share their stories, we can do that as an agency, right? So that's our kind of most urgent priority, I would say. Honestly, we should have been doing this 15 years ago, because these stories, like once they're gone, they are gone. The second recommendation, and I think Laura mentioned this before too, is we would love to see more center histories like the one that we did for Acadia, with these other centers at national parks, just because they are, each one is different. Each one has different stories, and we hope that other parks may follow suit and decide to do this. And if there's anyone on this webinar that is from a park that has one of these Job Corps centers and wants to talk about creating a project, you're more than welcome to reach out to me, and we can talk about it. So we hope to see more efforts in the future along these lines. The third recommendation, so with my regular job, I help parks identify properties, historic properties for the National Register, and all of the resources associated with the Job Corps Center. So, the centers themselves, things that the Job Corps built in and outside the national parks, these are all 50 years old now and can be considered for the National Register. So I think we've outlined the significance pretty well for the Job Corps Center and its association with the War on Poverty, this national program. I think it gets tough when it comes to integrity, because a lot of these resources are things that people use every day and don't tend to think of something as worthy of preservation. And this also happens with resources associated with marginalized communities, where integrity, kind of the National Register framework for integrity, can be prohibitive to nominating and listing those resources. So I think it's kind of the same issue with the Job Corps, but it's definitely something that we as an agency should be doing, to be working through. And then the fourth and fifth recommendation are kind of tied together, and Laura has also alluded to these too, and that is kind of the contemporary relevance of this kind of research. So, ever since I started working on the Job Corps, I see calls for a reboot of the CCC all the time. Seems like every other month I'm seeing like, let's bring back the CCC, which is all fine and good. But I think we've shown like we have done that. We have brought, we did create the Job Corps. We do have all these MPS youth programs now. So we have done it. So I think what this calls for is some critical self-reflection as an agency on our MPS youth programs, and asking some questions about, are we truly getting at our intended audience? Are we really matching our goals? Kind of all these different questions. And I think that having a service-wide study on MPS youth programs in the past 50 years, I think that's going to help a lot with showing kind of the lessons learned and what we can take with us in the future. Because youth programs are still really, if you read any kind of MPS, like strategic goals type document, youth programming, relevancy, diversity, inclusion, these are major initiatives that we are undertaking. And as a historian, I would like us to see us look at our past efforts to see what lessons we can learn for our current and future efforts. So with that, I think that concludes our presentation. We would love to open it up to you all for questions. So Gail, how would you like to do questions? We'll let you handle that.
Yeah, thank you, Laura and Angie. That was great. Perfect. Yeah, I guess anybody has questions, you can, there's, 25 people on, so I think you could just unmute and talk if you want, or you could type it in the chat or raise your hand. And there's a question in the chat. Was it an explicit goal of the program to recruit a more diverse group, or was it happenstance?
Oh, it was definitely on purpose. And Laura can also speak to this, but the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, they advertised in Black newspapers, for example. And when they were getting the program off the ground, they were targeting kind of these inner city areas and then also some of these rural Appalachian counties. So it was targeted initially.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, you basically covered it all there, but they did a lot of recruiting, like in the Black press, billboards, military recruitment centers would sometimes refer young people to the Job Corps to try to get their educational levels up. So there were a variety of recruitment techniques, or tactics, but they definitely were targeting a more diverse range of young men for the program. Hi, Clint.
Hi, I was a 1968 college graduate who, because of a childhood injury, was not in those Vietnam years militarily eligible and thought that I should serve my country. So I enrolled in VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. And I did my training out in Denver at the University of Colorado Denver campus. And our entire training class was told at some point that we were all destined to go to Job Corps.
Wow.
And towards the end of the training period, which was, I guess, about 6 weeks, we received our announcements, and I was surprised that I was assigned to Acadia because that was about a 5-hour drive from where I went to college. Maybe that's why they assigned me there. Familiarity. I too was surprised when I arrived, but I had lived in that climate, so it wasn't quite as shocking as some of the fellows who got off the bus and said, "Holy mackerel." But one of the things that hasn't been mentioned in any of the literature that I've seen, and I think it was probably not limited to Acadia, but my impression, and I was there from the fall of '68 till the closing. I am actually one of the few people in the picture of the Job Corps Center history, as I'm putting together the history of the Job Corps. I'm in that one of the photographs in there. My impression was that the major system, at least at Acadia, and I have no scientific basis for this, no reputable statistical basis for this, just anecdotally, the major recruiter for Job Corpsmen at Acadia were judges. And it was literally, you want to go to jail or do you want to go to Job Corps? Huh? And an amazing number of men, not an amazing, but a large number of young men said, well, if it's not jail, I'll go to Job Corps. And so the atmosphere at Job Corps was sort of like a prison, sort of like a very liberal prison. And that atmosphere did clash with that chart that you said there were a number of rural New England people there. The rural New England people there took it as an opportunity to improve, and the urban young men took it as an opportunity to avoid jail. The dormitories were raucous, to say the least. Hardly a day would go by when one didn't need to unplug the toilets by Job Corpsmen throwing down entire rolls of toilet paper into the toilets. So it was quite ugly. And that was quite shocking to the rural contingent. Skipping along, I had a great thrill when I was a teacher. I was hired mainly as a teacher. And so I was in the classrooms. But of course, I lived there on campus, so to speak, in one of the house trailers that they had. They had about 8 house trailers down the road, and I was paid $20 a week. The classroom was fun to me. There were people who slept in the back all the time, and there were people who saw it as an opportunity. And once again, it was easy to divide up who was who, because the urban kids were a tough group, and the rural kids were at the front of the class. And I was very privileged in the very short amount of time that I got there from I guess November, maybe October or November of '68 until the closing. When I did have students, I was very pleased. One student, Vic, I think it's Krezhanowski was his last name. I have it written down somewhere else. He went from I think never having gone beyond the 6th grade. In 3 months, he's got his GED. I mean, he came there with like a 6th or 7th grade education, and he left with a GED in just a couple of months. It was just fantastic, and it was one of the great thrills of my life. I have a picture of him somewhere. But it was a prison. It was a prison for most people, and those like Krezhanowski endured it because they still saw it as an opportunity. They still saw it as their way out. A lot of the people from rural New England came from bad families, and it was better than living in the woods with their bad families. So that was a wonderful thing. And yes, I remember Bradley, and I remember other people I think I remember Bradley, and I remember other people from the city who also broke out of the city mold and did well in the education classes. But there's no question in my mind that it was a rough place to be, especially at night in the dorms. There was a lot of stuff going on that was not pleasant, to say the least, and stuff that many of the people in the dorm simply put up with because they saw the Job Corps as their only way out. And I'll tell you, when news came, shortly after I got there, practically, when news came that the place was closing, it was a very quiet and sad time. I have a distinct memory of how many of the corpsmen, and this crossed all lines, black, white, rural, urban, how many of the corpsmen enjoyed learning how to cook. It was big. That was a big thing. And and the corpsmen indulged and did get involved in cooking. And as a side anecdote, it was at the Job Corps that I learned that donuts are not baked; they're fried. But they had great donuts there at the Job Corps, and the corpsmen loved making them. It was a combination of the administration was a combination of government bureaucrats, military type of disciplinarians, and new wave la people. It was just crazy. The community in Bar Harbor and on the island, I did not personally see antagonism, but I did read about it. I was there not in the summer months because I got there, like I say, around November, and it closed in May or something like that. So I did not see the tourist or the summer crowds reactions. I just saw the locals, maybe it was because I was taken under the arm of a local who was also a teacher who lived there, and he was very much in favor of what the Job Corps site was doing, that I just met locals who had that same sort of feeling about it. I did not see any, I know it existed, I know it did happen, but I did not see any overtly racist or antagonistic reactions among the locals in that very short time that I was there. And maybe that gives a little bit more weight to the, I think I heard somewhere in the presentation that the seasonal people, the summer people, might have been more antagonistic than the locals. And that the locals' lack of antagonism really surprised me. I was very pleasantly surprised by the fact that they took these kids, I was going to say to heart or under their wings, not really, but sort of took the kids to heart and under their wings. And there were occasions when there was indeed kids who were invited to locals for dinner and stuff like that. And that did happen. There were also, and I alluded to this earlier, there were also some horrible events, but
Hey, Clint, I would like to get in touch with you and maybe capture some of this, the oral history, if you don't mind.
no problem.
Yeah.
I actually, I have to shut up too, because I've got to get going, but I just wanted to give those anecdotes to you.
It.
And it was a wonderful place. It was, as far as I'm concerned, it was the best location to be. Bar Harbor, what a wonderful place. I wish I'd been able to spend the summer there with the corpsmen. And I'm sure that when the good weather came and they were in 6 feet of snow, that they enjoyed it while they were there too. It was really, really depressing to have it shut down so quickly.
Yeah. There are a couple other questions and we have 10 minutes left. So thank you, Clint, for some of that. It's very interesting.
Thank you, Clint.
I mean, I just want to say,
yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Smith, for chiming in and sharing your thoughts and memories. I think that just really goes to show how important oral histories are to understanding these centers. In 5-7 minutes, Mr. Smith could tell you a lot more about the Job Corps than Laura and I, who have studied it for a couple of years.
One item, Angela, I think when you were giving your introduction, you said the centers were all located west of the Mississippi. I think you meant to say east.
Oh, I did. Thank you. Good thing I had a map and you all could figure it out.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, can I just say one thing? I know we're getting to other questions here, but I think this speaks to, Gail and Angie and I have had conversations about how we see this research as really kind of a starting point. And we know that there's a lot that's incomplete. And, it took a lot of digging to find the material that we did, and a lot of dead ends trying to find people to interview. And like Clint emailed Gail, was it like a week or two ago?
Yeah.
So like, what we're excited about is that we've got this starting point, and we hope that this will help bring other people, bring it to the attention of other people who maybe you'll get more people at the park. Maybe you'll hear about more people who were served in Job Corps and are coming back for another visit. And so we just see this as a starting point. We're excited to get it out there, and hopefully it'll bring in more information. So.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, this history was written, but it's not finished by any means. And I think this is a great illustration of that, how it's, we've kind of uncovered some stuff, and then there's more, just layers coming off, which is cool.
Right.
Okay, question in the chat. Do you know who the supervisors were, and did they reflect the racial diversity of the Corps as a whole? No. Yeah, they were mostly white, right?
They were mostly white. There was one interesting anecdote, and I can't remember the specific details or the year. I don't know if it was when Clint was there, but there was a Spanish-speaking instructor who the center had hired to teach some of the students who needed help with English language instruction. And he was laid off, and there was a lot of it was very upsetting to the staff of the center, because they felt like he was a really critical component of the staff. And I guess the Park Service and the OEO just couldn't keep him on for whatever reason. So no,
it was a contracting issue.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I read a grievance letter where they were so mad. They were so mad about it. Yeah, I mean, there are examples of folks who were African American that worked in some of the centers, but it definitely, statistically didn't reflect the proportion of the corpsmen. The staff level was mostly white. What I've seen is a lot of Park Service folks jumped over, from their Park Service jobs into these, they were OEO positions. The center director was kind of at the same level, graded the same as the park superintendent, which actually caused some tensions at parks because they didn't know who their boss was. Was it the superintendent? Was it the OEO? But there are some examples of African Americans getting these Job Corps jobs, and then when the centers closed, they went and got federal employment positions and were able to kind of go up the ranks.
Right. I think that actually leads into someone else's question about whether any of the people who finished the program were actually hired by the park or elsewhere in the federal government. No, not at Acadia. I don't know if Angie, if you've seen any of that, but
yeah, there were definitely initiatives trying to get folks hired on as like seasonals and things like that, but I haven't seen anyone who made the jump from Job Corps to permanent employment. Doesn't mean that they're not out there, but I just haven't seen it. But there were initiatives trying to get them into kind of like seasonal positions.
Right. And in some ways, we found that it's very hard to track outcomes of the program. There's a lot of statistics about the corpsmen when they were in Job Corps, but the OEO did not do a great job of tracking corpsmen after they left. So what we found was, at least from the data that we have, it appears that it was a really good stepping stone for staff and for like Vista volunteers. Like, it was a really good thing to have on your resume to move on to another position or move within the park, as Angie was saying. But so we know that in some ways the positive job outcomes were for staff, and we're not quite sure how great the outcomes were for the corpsmen themselves.
And we do know that some of the corpsmen did end up going into the military. And of course, this was during Vietnam. So, it was not so much a Job Corps to military pipeline, so to say, but, some of these young men like did not have the education skills to pass to qualify for military service. And so the Job Corps helped them kind of to get to that point, and then they could go in. And so that's, kind of debatable whether or not that's like an improvement or not, since it was Vietnam.
Okay, another question, chat. Did the closing of the center have to do with protests from the locals or lack of funding? No.
No, it was really Nixon reducing the program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Anastasia, could you distill this very interesting comment? I know it's a lot.
I'm so sorry for rambling. I guess
No.
I just was interested in your thoughts about the lessons in terms of how to balance people of color and urban youths not having access to the outdoors, and especially people of color in US history only having access to the outdoors through work and labor, whereas white people have access through recreation. So in terms of not just economic justice, but like environmental justice, does the Job Corps have any lessons for us?
I think, to me, the lesson for the Job Corps is this attitude of let's remove people from their circumstances and drop them in these national parks, and that's going to solve a lot of their problems. I mean, seriously, that was kind of the attitude. That was certainly that, it's kind of from the CCC era, like, we're putting people to work in national parks and that's going to make them better citizens, and those kinds of things. And I think that really ignores the importance of kinship, of family networks, and all these things that are part of their home environments, right? But it was just kind of this attitude of, certainly working in a national park will be better from wherever they came from. I think those types of attitudes we need to be very, very careful about, and kind of this very paternalistic kind of thing. Like, let's just put those troubled youth, to work in the national parks and everything will be great. And yeah, I think that's pretty disingenuous.
And it was the same kind of attitude as Peace Corps at the time too, which was, let's take these, these young Americans and plop them into totally different, so it's understandable that they would come up with this model. But yeah.
Good intentions, but
yeah,
not great. Yeah, not well thought out.
In practical. Yeah. But yeah, it's a good, this is the topic right here that we're trying to figure out right now, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that I never well, I was there only briefly, but I never heard of anybody trying to escape, quote unquote. Nobody tried to run away. I did hear about some people. I did hear about one or two corpsmen who went AWOL from time to time, but I did not hear. It may have happened, but I never heard of people trying to, or actually escaping and running away and disappearing. May have happened.
I think we missed one question from Nadia Westenberg about visits to the women's corps centers.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I'm just scrolling through here. Were any of the female crews associated with the Park Service? No, all of the conservation centers, I think Angie mentioned this, all of the conservation centers were all men, all young men. And the women's centers, I think, Angie, they tended to be mostly in urban areas, right?
Yeah, they would put them up at places like hotels.
Right.
Yeah, it was kind of a different animal. And with the women's centers, when they were initially putting together the legislation, they were not considering women at all. It wasn't until Congresswoman Edith Green from Oregon, in a hearing for the war and poverty legislation, was like, hey, women need opportunities too. And so, the task force was like, whoa, sure, yeah, we need to do that. So, they scrambled and put together a women's program, but it is interesting that there were only urban centers, that they didn't think that conservation work was appropriate for women at the time. Yeah, so it's really interesting. And then the Youth Conservation Corps, which came in after the Job Corps and the Park Service, that one was for both high school students, boys and girls. So after the Job Corps, then you start to see kind of mixed genders doing youth programs.
That reminds me, one of the great things that the guys liked at Acadia were the toys. And what do I mean by toys? They got to operate heavy equipment. They got to operate chainsaws. They got to operate caterpillars. They got to operate big trucks. They got to operate a lot of big machines, and they really loved that. They loved operating big, noisy machines that took down trees, that moved boulders. Man, that was fun for them.
We still love that at Acadia. All right, well, it is a little after 1 o'clock. Any final comments, questions? I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, everyone. Clint.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Great job.
Thank you. Bye-bye.